Welcome to the 7th episode of Positionality Podcast. In this episode, we are discussing some hard topic, but a much needed one. Before we get started, I want to thank Tenzin Chiang and Tanya Simanian for being the front and center of this episode and have this up and running. In today's topic, we are talking about trauma. We all carry trauma, whether that's from our past, from our parents, relationships, or just simply existing as human beings in this world. Right now, we're all experiencing a collective trauma reinforced by COVID-19. In times like this, we are recognizing how important it is to go inward and find peace within the chaos life throws at us. And as Tibetans, we not only carry trauma as being displaced, but also having to make a whole life outside of our native language, culture, and people. We Tibetans are survivors along with other natives, people of color, LGBTQIAs, and literally anyone who's displaced. Tibetans had no choice but to make a home of a foreign country, dress like the people that they live with, talk like them, or to simply put food on the table and clothes to wear and roof over the head. So in this episode, we're discussing what trauma is, how it manifests in different forms, and what it looks like in our lives. Most importantly, how do we turn pain into wisdom, and what is the significance of making sure that they are dealt with? Joining us, we have Penpa Dolma from Arcadia, Colorado. Penpa has more than 10 years of yoga practice, and she teaches both Western and Eastern technique to her students. Her passion is to help youth find their inner voice and embody them into a responsible global citizen. Penpa believes that one of the ways to change the world is through individual awakening and self-awareness. Penpa has earned her yoga degree from Yoga Institute of Science and Research in Indore, India. Her certification training emphasizes on meditation, mindfulness, Ayurveda, and yoga therapy. Prior to that, she also earned her Bachelor of Science in Psychology and minor in Biology. Penpa was born in Tibet and went to TCV school before she moved to the U.S. Welcome, Penpa.
Thank you so much, Susie. Glad to be here. A pleasure.
Thank you for being with us, Penpa. I feel honored to share this space with you and excited to dive deep into this.
Sounds great. I just want to I do like, what do you call it, content warning kind of stuff, right? Like we are talking about trauma and our listeners might get triggers in their bodies. So I would recommend anybody who's listening to be in a kind of a safe place, a place where you enjoy and you feel protected and safe, so that when the conversation comes up, resistance comes up, anxiety comes up, and all sorts of emotions might rise, and then if that comes up, then you actually have a safety, a safe place to process this or to go out in nature or whatever you need to do. So if you're in an agitated space, try to listen to this when you're in a calmer place where you can hold space for yourself.
Great point. Yeah, it's so important that you're in a space in mind and in a physical space to actually listen to this. Penpa, what pronouns do you identify with?
I use she and they because I'm still uncovering, this non-binary world.
Mm-hmm. Right. And you have your own yoga practice, right?
Yes.
What role does yoga play in your life, and what made you decide that you want to be a yoga instructor?
Yeah, so, from this awareness that I have been very disconnected from my body, that I live in a head, it is very intellectual, kind of space, and then feeling like unsafe in my own body, but not knowing how to be with this, and noticing that disembodiment. So it was a part of the embodiment practices to come back on earth into this body from the cosmic emptiness world of Tibetan Buddhism. Back in there, and that's what led the journey for me. It was really a healing journey.
Wow. Personally, I discovered the power of yoga only this year. I've heard about the benefit and how life-altering it is for some of my friends and on social media. But until I was really consistent and patient with doing the yoga, only then I felt like I saw the result. And it was only then when I started doing yoga, I had the patience for meditation, and then which also kind of led to journaling. So all of these techniques really helped me realize how much trauma I was carrying in my body, my whole childhood, and as an adult. And I also realized how many people carry trauma and not even realizing that they carry trauma. You know, it's easy to associate trauma as something that's major or an event such as an accident or a breakup and death, which are all valid, but it can also be in many different forms and can show up in unexpectedly in different parts of one's life, body, and in relationship. Penpa, could you explain what trauma is and what does that look like when trauma is not healed?
Yeah, I feel like, what you just mentioned was really the crux of it. Like, trauma, the design of the trauma is that we have to dissociate from our body. Because in the event that when it happened, it was not safe for us to exist the way we are. So we had to dissociate from it and then put on, roles of survivals. Right? And so the way that the trauma is kind of operationally defined is like trauma is like a response to a deeply distressing or disturbing events that overwhelms an individual's ability to cope and causes feelings of helplessness and diminishes their sense of self and the ability to feel full range of emotions and experiences. And especially, I think it's true for like a full range of expressions of joy and pleasure, because of living in a traumatic body and then looking at through the lens of suffering so much. And then also an ability to feel our grief. There's like the hyper-arousal aspect of it, and then there's a numbing, hypo-arousal aspect. You either dissociate, isolate, and go into that. So it's like a polarity, basically. That's what trauma does. Is it makes everything black and white.
Wow. So you said it was black and white, and you're just unable to see kind of clearly of what the reality is. Is that?
Yes, exactly. Either you look into everything with like a dark lens or like a bypass love and light white lens kind of. And not having all the nuances of being a human, able to hold space for everything that actually arises. That's kind of part of it. Like we only have go into reactive mode.
And this kind of reminds me of just being Tibetans and coming from Tibet and living in India and in the United States. As personally for me, I've never experienced directly with the Chinese army, but I did left Tibet and you left Tibet and we both went to TCV. The whole TCV school was really just focused on preserving the culture, the language, and there was just a huge push for free Tibet. And, and also in diaspora, when people don't speak Tibetans, many are quick to say, well, you need to learn Tibetan. If you don't, you're not Tibetan. Is that also kind of a trauma response from what happened?
Totally. The aspiration to preserve the tradition and culture and ways of life, that's not the trauma part. That's the aspiration. That's the beautiful part of it, right? Because we have been displaced, so there is that wish and a desire to keep it intact. That's not the trauma part. The trauma part is the method through which we're trying to achieve that, right? We know from our TCV experience that it is through the punitive disciplinary actions and manipulations that we were conformed to, preserving the culture. And this is not to say that's a bad or good. It's just the limitation of the trauma That's what trauma does. It's like it just cannot imagine any other way than white and black. So it does that. And so it's this shaming, a conforming into orders versus, invigorating with inspiration, with pleasure and joy into preserving this. Like we can magnetize somebody to preserve, or we can control and oppress and, instill fear in people to speak Tibetans, right? And every Tibetan will decide for themselves which one is truer to our, our community.
So, obviously, you do a lot of trauma-informed work at work. You do a lot of healing for your clients, and I'm sure it has to start somewhere within you to help others. If you feel comfortable sharing, what are some ways trauma has shown up in your life, and what kind of trauma work have you done?
Yeah, so I feel for me, it was really like I wanted to be loved and I wanted love, but I couldn't. I would not allow people to love me, and I couldn't love others unconditionally either. And the emotion that would keep coming was anger, and
Anger.
People who knew me from TCD can attest to it. Like I'm like one of the jingbums that was saying, "You're so jingbum," right? Again. I will not, take any moment to, pause on my emotion. I would just erupt when I'm angry and stuff like that. So in my intimate relationship, it will show up like anytime. And part of the trauma is like, it makes us really hyper-vigilant. And the hyper-vigilance is constantly like testing if we're safe in the space or not. Even when we're safe, we are kind of like, really tunnel vision into looking at everybody's flaws, as if they're humans, as if they're perfect people. And then we get hooked on the negative that we see, and then we, exaggerate that, and that becomes like the contention of the drama, that the conflict that we get stuck in. When maybe there's so many things, great things working in our relationship, but that was at least for myself. It's like, I'm loved and everything's good and life's taken care of, but I couldn't let go of what I was stuck at. And if I could heal this, or if I could change you, if I could manipulate into changing you, if I could control you, then you turn into somebody whom I feel safe with, then only I can relax. Otherwise, I'm not going to hold myself up, So it was really like a insecure attachment kind of style that was showing up. And it was the anger, and that led me into this path. And then, of course, when we try to work with anger, realize the importance of boundaries, understanding of the violation that has happened that made you erupt with the anger and the compassion. So it was like a really inward journey, and every door kind of opened to the next door into this journey.
Wow.
That makes sense.
And so what kind of trauma work have you done to heal that?
Yeah. So what I started was like, first was the somatic experiencing, is what they call it. It starts actually like yoga was really great entry into it, right? Like, yoga allowed me to move certain stuck energy that allowed me to be open to other perspectives, and that like other perspectives were allowed to flow through, because it won't get stuck in my biased lens, and I would trap it and project it and make it into something else. But it would allow it to move so that something new would arise out. So that was like, I really felt differently, like I felt lighter. There wasn't that sort of heaviness. It felt a little bit lighter and lighter. And then yoga was such a beautiful entry into it, but yoga is also very rigid in certain ways. And it was even a little bit more aggressive for me. So restorative yoga, yin yoga, which are much more gentle yoga, was helpful for the trauma-ridden body. So people who do ashtangas, vinyasas, and all of these, and if we haven't developed safety in our own body and know our own tendency to aggress and have ambition and all of this come up, there's a tendency to injure ourselves through the yoga practice. So as a yoga teacher, I would see so many people who go into yoga with injured bodies, and they would come back and say, I did the yoga I've been doing for the last 10 years, and now I had to have a hip replacement, all of these things. You just because of not understanding where we're at right now, And like our body can do this, and if we're used to having a lot of pain tolerance, we would push the body until it, tears and shears, So there's that aspect, and that led me into the somatic. It's been much more gentler, taking permission of the bones and the muscles and the connective tissues of the body in order to make the movement, like not moving before the body gives me permission, just because my head and eyes look around and everybody's making some shape, and then I'm just trying to copy that and then force myself into those. So that kind of stuff. It's a lot of titration, that happened. And so I did from that to somatic experience, and I did a lot of shadow work. The shadow work is really, and it's a Jungian kind of word. The shadow is what is in the unconscious, right? And what's in the unconscious is everything that we have not processed, that we have not, validated, looked at, embraced, and honored, and nurtured, and gave it what medicine it needs to be on the surface and loved, So everything that we were taught goes into the shadow aspect of it. So I did a lot of intentional work. Even now, I'm in the process of diving even deeper into it. It's like every trigger that comes up, every resistance that I do, every butterfly in my stomach, everything like that, it's like there's energy underneath that. And so what is that? If I'm feeling angry, what's going on here, And then you trace the kind of origin. Not everything has to be traced like that, because not all of us have the privilege of the time that I feel like I have. But at least being aware that some underlying energy is actually running the show. Not the reaction is not the personality. It's something else going on.
So it seems like it's trauma work is never done. It's more of how you can find the tools at the moment.
Yeah, you integrate them. All the trauma, you integrate them, and we become more whole. So what trauma does, it fragments us, and we feel like I'm Tibetan, and now I'm Tibetan. What about what I'm a human? I'm not a human. I'm a human being too, and I'm a woman or whatever body you came in, and then now I'm in America, and then. I'm a wife and a mother and a friend. So there's a lot of roles we play. But what trauma does is wherever the trauma happened, that becomes like the fixated identity through which. So it's fragmented. What we're trying to do with trauma work is integrate the wholeness of the whole. Even anger has a place. But when we work with anger, we feel like, no, you're not part of me. But we're integrating anger because anger is a deity of wisdom. There is an there's a violation of a sacred samaya, collective oath of being each other's keeper. That's been violated, and you're feeling angry. So there's a validity. Now, how are you going to process this? And now, how are you going to become skillful in communicating this violation without becoming the oppressor?
And it seems anger is just another way of your body saying, there's something wrong and you need to look at it.
Yeah.
And that it needs to be validated too in order to heal.
Yes. And uncover its wisdom, what it's trying to bring, the message is trying to bring.
Right. And I feel like in this topic, we can just keep going on and on. But the next thing I was curious about, people-pleasing behavior. So I've shared this with you. I saw your Instagram post about people-pleasing behavior, and how as Tibetans and as refugees, we are kind of conditioned from our childhood to please others and make sure that the other person doesn't feel a certain way in your presence. And I think about that so much because as an adult now, I just have so much people-pleasing tendency, which I really hate and don't like about myself. But I acknowledge that. So every time I'm doing that, I'm consciously saying hey, what are you doing? Is this genuine? So have you experienced people-pleasing behavior yourself?
For sure, for sure. And I would think that I'm not a people pleaser, because it's being a loner and try not to please, but it's just so rampant. It's impossible to escape people pleasing in a way that we have been bred, I guess. I feel like the people pleasing is like so beautiful, right? Like in Buddhist, there is the aspect of like we want to please people, there is that aspect, and the way that we are people pleasing came more out of the survival, right? Because our body was not pleasing to the Chinese, they needed to occupy us and actually eradicate our existence. So there's an aspect of like. Even if it's not said outward, but there is an inherent kind of feeling of like this body is not a good body to be in, so the only way for it to be safe is to keep pleasing the others and say like, look at me, I'm a good person, I'm a sweet person, I'm a non-violent person, I'm a peaceful person, I'm a wise person, or whatever. I'm not a threat to you. So there's constant like an aspect of like that happening, that dynamic. I feel like on one side, like people pleasing is such a beautiful. We live in a collective world. We want to please everybody. But are we pleasing, like you were saying, is it genuine? Is it coming from a place of your cup being fully full and that's overflowing? Or we are pleasing people on the detriment of our own health, where we're feeling completely empty, but we're pleasing because that's the only way to survive. The way we know that we are, functioning from an empty cup is we will please others and not please ourselves. We will be filled with resentment, anger, despair, hopelessness, and helplessness, and they're all residing inside. That means like that need to be taken care of first. That's what shows like I'm not feeling full inside. The love that you give for others, please yourself. Do what's good for you first. When this flows, like when this gets full, then please, So it's a boundary issue, I think.
Right. And I agree with you. People pleasing generally is not like terrible. I think, it's a surviving tool. And I think about my family, my dad and my aunt who are Tibetans, and they have to get the white man to like them in order for them to pick their business. And I think I was telling you this, Penpa, but like I used to be so upset by the fact that they always said thank you, like over thank you, and just like making sure the white man is comfortable. And it would just like outrage me as a child, and even as a teenager, I would say like, "What are you doing? Don't do that. You don't need to do that." And it's interesting how my response is also trauma response, and what my family was doing was also trauma response.
Yeah, I feel like I'm always looking for like a wisdom quality in everything that we do instead of neurosis. And part of where I feel is like there is such a wisdom in your anger. It's like, why are you trying to please a white man? And even if we're not able to connect it consciously, there is an aspect of like now that the collective trauma of not just the COVID, right, the whole decolonization, the white supremacy, the capitalism is coming up and everybody's doing the work. You really could see it's like, why are we pleasing white men? Aren't they the problem in the world? Isn't the whole globe suffering because of that white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism mingled together in such a union? So, I look at that as like, I think at the crux of, from a Buddhist point of view, I feel like why it deviates from Buddhism for me is it's not truthful. It's over-pleasing, it's exaggeration, and numbing yourself and not giving enough credit for the white people for being a human being. They are still human beings, right? Even if they're born into the collective, white skin and the privileges that comes with it, and the drawbacks of those privileges, what you can see as a result of having those privileges. And so there's all of that intersecting in it. So kind of like keeping the human and respecting that, like we are all equal, like His Holiness says and Buddhism says, like everybody's equal. And then from there, you kind of look at it. I feel like the judgment is because it's not an honest and a truthful relationship. And because it's not a truthful relationship, we're not able to hold powers accountable so that the powers can dismantle if the power is not poured for the collective.
Right.
It's mentally really hard because of the pleasing aspect. And I think that's part of why the shame of pleasing white patriarchy or moneyed people or whatever, as a result of us needing to survive, is there's a great shame of, having sold some part of us, and it keeps us silent and we're able to be equal, eye to eye. And I don't have to kill you, I don't have to hate you, I don't have you. This is not okay. We got to change this.
So, Penpa, what is generational trauma, and what has your experience like being a Tibetan woman?
The generational trauma is kind of like similar to ancestral trauma.
Right.
And so the unprocessed loss, grief, whatever emotions that are in the other, our ancestral generation comes to us, And I feel like the way that it presents itself in the Tibetan community is like you said, the punitive culture, like this aspect of shaming and being super harsh and basically punishing, like upbringing us with those kind of, instead of love, which is like the core tenets of Buddhism. And so we have this profound understanding of love and compassion as being the only energy that actually moves and works us into our full bloom. But the trauma hijacks that wisdom, and then it runs us through this, controlling, oppressing, dominating kind of like way of molding us. And then like we're also giving, like in a way, one of the things that it presents itself is like the elder generation giving the next generation the task that it didn't fulfill. And the task of the next generation is to, take the love of the ancestral generation and the creativity and innovation and the natural intelligence, the wisdom of the next generation to actually, move that energy in a healing way, but we get stuck. And because we do feel like we have to please our parents the most.
Right.
So we'll imprison ourselves to fulfill. And I think that's detrimental to the cause as well.
Penpa, is it true that like everyone holds some kind of trauma, whether that's generational or collective, just everyone holds trauma, right? Like in their body as human beings.
Yeah, like I would believe that would be a true statement. Like from a Buddhist perspective, I feel like when Buddhism talks about samsara, to me it's a trauma world. Like samsara is a world run by trauma. And it's run by confusion, right? It's run by the ignorance that leads to the, attachment and aversion and stuff like that. I do feel like it would be true statement to say that we live in a traumatized world. Since the, oppression hasn't stopped anywhere. And as Tibetans, we know that our trauma is as a result of oppression. And I feel like the cause of the oppression is, first and foremost, ignorance of our true nature, and then having the up and down, good and bad, the duality, the polarity, the binary, and the binary traps us. And we live in a binary world. At least in the dominant powers live in that. And so I do feel like there is that aspect. And where we're going towards, I feel like there's a lot of healing happening also, because we're recognizing those, and a lot of effort to dismantle that.
Thanks for sharing that. And also, I think people who go through life, whether what profession they have, whether they're a teacher, lawyer, doctor, astronaut, whatever profession they have, whatever their point at life, not many people have processed their trauma, and it shows in various ways. No matter how much life experience they have, like what position they are in life, whether they're making tons of money, trauma does not care for anyone's money. They just it happens, and everyone has to deal with that. And even what's happening now with the hate against Asian people, not just in the United States, there's other countries as well. It's deeply traumatizing to know that people are getting killed because of the skin that they have or the race. So I think even if you're not Tibetan, or even if you don't share the same country, just the fact that you're a woman and you're Asian, like it reaches out to people, and it, in some ways, I think it does affect people. Penpa, can you shine some light on this?
Yeah, for sure. And it's like a really, complex topic to talk about. I feel like if we allowed our hearts to be touched by what happened to those 8 Asians and to see our own face on their face, it is completely possible that that would be us, or that could happen to us. So if you really sit with that and to know that, like, can we go to work, like nothing happened, right? And it would be impossible to go. We would be in a state of like great distress that we won't be able to function. And then there's the truth of that we need to pay our bills and we need to survive, and all of that coming in. And so it just feels like my reality doesn't allow me to grieve and process, of this reality, that other reality that's going on. And so I think we numb, basically. This is one of the trauma response, is either to become so hyper-vigilant and hyper-aroused to the state of great distress and not able to function at all, to the other side of it, to become numb and dissociated and bypass that. And the cause of that bypassing is we become complacent in keeping the system that's unjust for everybody. And so it's an inquiry, right? Like we need to examine individually, everyone needs to examine on our own. Is this life worth living like that? And individually making that a decision, because we cannot be forced by others. Anytime somebody tries to force us into buying into whatever agendas, is like there is an inherent, innate system that works against that, because it doesn't feel autonomous and sovereign. And so the self-examination has to happen on the individual level. Like, what kind of world do I want to live in? And what is my participation and engagement in on a daily basis? Not just in my body, like action, in my words and in my dreaming, imagination, in my mind. So that question needs to be asked, I feel. And to know that when we examine it more and get more educated and informed about it, we kind of see the pattern. The pattern of a Tibetan, trauma is a pattern of, another refugee's trauma, or, a trauma of slavery, or, LGBTQ. There is like a pattern of trauma that happens. So when we see it, we kind of looks like majority of us in the world are actually in a traumatic state. And so we have the power too. But that power comes when we're able to and willing to sit and touch our pain, listen to what its needs are, meet those needs, cultivate a compassion and openness and curiosity and forgiveness, all of that stuff. When we do it ourselves, then we start seeing other people as human beings who are going through the similar experience, instead of like just what we see on Instagram, or appearance or image that everybody's trying to, the mask that everybody's trying to put on, that I'm fine. When we're saying we're living in a broken, spirit inside. So I feel that we can become more vulnerable as a society, that we could all become vulnerable. That when we look at each other, we don't see the mask. We actually see somebody who's hurting. So there's a kindness and compassion extended to that. Misunderstanding each other. That we cannot assume, because everybody's, experiences is very unique, yet collectively so common. There is that, I don't know, there's a beautiful dance between the inner and the outer world, and the beautiful boundaries, and having your own sovereignty, and then also engaging with the collective, into moving it into the collective dream that we all want to live in.
Wow, thanks for that. This is a broad question, but how would one go about healing? And I think you lightly touched on this earlier, but let's say this is someone who has never sat down and who've never really recognized that they had trauma, but that there's learning some patterns that they have that, seems like what you're describing. What would be the first step, or what will be the steps for them to heal?
Yeah, it's the self-awareness part, right? Like becoming aware of patterns that are dysfunctional. And the best way to know those is like whatever relationships we are in, whether with our parents or with our children or with our lovers and friends and world in general, like is there a sense of distrust and unsafety, anger, resentment, all of that stuff. These are all gateways into the healing work. Whatever your special gate is. For me, it was anger. For somebody, it might be some other addiction. Somebody, it might be sadness. It might be apathy. It might be people pleasing.
Right.
It might be whatever that gate is. It's very unique to individual, and so just notice what is your dominant pattern that you constantly like. You do it, and then you shame yourself for doing that.
Yeah.
That you feel So like shame could be one of the path, and for Tibetans maybe it's a guilt, survival's guilt of having survived and not being able to do much for the collective, right? Because I had that one really deeply. I was like, given education by TCV and said that I was the seed of the future Tibet and the global citizen and all of this, and I don't even know how to, contribute. And the shame and the guilt that comes from that, that all of this becomes like an entry point into the healing. And so we know that what is ours to do. And so our ancestors, our collective will give all these, like this is your responsibility, but what is your responsibility? So you have to look inward to see like, no, that's your job that you did not finish. That it's not mine to finish. I have a very specific task in this cosmos to do. And that will be integrating part of the ancestral stuff, but we are not, 100% our ancestral, and we need that autonomy, that individualism, in the collective, and respect for both the relative and the absolute world, and then dancing that in a healthy way.
Right.
It starts with self-awareness, basically.
Start with self-awareness, okay. And it seems, Penpa, you went to TCV and I went to TCV, and it might not have been the way they saw or they visioned how we would, be the future of Tibet. But both of us, in our own ways, were doing something like you. I'm sure there's a lot more other than yoga, but we're all really contributing. Even with this podcast, in our own way, I think we are contributing in some ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like there is a need to really honor the individual process that's going through. Like, because we live in a collective world, we have a tendency to make everybody conform to the view of, one thing or the other thing, and not see that by doing that, we're excluding probably a majority of the population who don't fit into this binary way of existing. Right. Who are much more like, they're uncovering and they're becoming their own. What I felt was like Tibet didn't, get occupied in isolation. It became occupied in the context of the world's politics. And we used to say that our loss happened because we were very isolated. Like when people from outer world came in, it would be like the white people would be dishonest, and others would not be engaging. We have isolated ourselves because somehow we have had a sense of a superiority, I think, right? That others are less. We're on the mountain, on the top, and then others are less. I don't know. I'm just making it up on my own rambling. So there's an aspect of thinking that we have the loss of our nation happen in isolation. And then, but when we looked at the context of it, when it's deconstructionalized, that looks like our personal, like a trauma. But when we put in the context, it's not just us who got occupied, right? There were many others. And then you look at the larger world and you see that basically when we were saying free Tibet onto the streets of India and the American, wherever we're saying free Tibet, why don't you give a, shit about us? Give us justice, this and this. And we're like, why is nobody listening to us? We have the truth. We're peaceful people. That sense of betrayal comes in. And then when you live here and you realize that we're living in a traumatized world where everybody is disempowered. Everybody's feeling like how many Tibetans show up for Black Lives Matter or LGBTQ? the sex trafficking and the indigenous nations and the refugees around the world right now, and the Latin American issues. It's just like the whole world is in trauma world. And so how many Tibetans engage in every one of them? Hardly any, right? Because we are not resourced enough. We don't even feel safe in our own body to deal with our own trauma. So we're not able to show up to for others, other causes. And I think that's kind of the whole world is kind of living in that. Like we're all in an overwhelmed system. It's like livelihood itself is overwhelming. The scarcity, capitalism is such that we don't have bandwidth and space to take care of everybody. So if we could understand all these nuances a little more, then we won't be so righteous in our anger. We won't poison ourselves with such, resentment against our own people.
Right. That's such a good point.
And that's how I feel like it's like we are only 6 million or so. And out of that, like I heard like 1 out of every 5 or 6 of Tibetans are already dead, right, through the genocide of that. So it's like we are precious, we are very rare, and how we treat each other is with such a mistrust a lot of times. And that's what I kind of recognize is like the reason why I don't show up to serve the community is because I don't feel safe to be myself. They'll try to conform me into their visions, and then I will, feel resentful and this and that. So I didn't feel resourced enough to go out. But with the trauma work, I feel a little bit more resourced. Like I feel like I can ask better questions that would bring us together instead of, project each other's trauma and create even more distance in our hearts.
Right. And that's amazing. You do what works for you. I was wondering, is there anything that you want to say to our viewers or anyone really?
I do. I want to say, the Tibetan community, this is not a thing to say so much, but I love you guys. I love you all, non-binary, LGBTQ, especially you guys. You, not guys, this is the word. It's like especially those who feel marginalized and excluded from the conversation. I love you. And, I know that you exist, even if I cannot see you on the screen. And this is a hard time to be alive, but we're here together. And we'll make it through, and so grateful that you exist. You don't have to do anything. Even as a Tibetan, if our ancestors will say, like, if shame or you're not doing enough. No, your existence itself is enough. Because you exist, you're carrying our, story in you. So I just wish that you are resourced enough that you will illuminate your gift, what you came here to do. How are you going to transform and transmute this trauma into your own art, into your own expression, so you will feel liberated and you don't have to perform for anybody, that you can be yourself. That's my love and wish for you all.
Oh, thank you, Penpa, for that message.
Yeah, thank you. And then this is a real, collaborative example, right? Here, we're all here together doing this. And this is the only way I think we'll liberate. It's like we'll do it together. Take care of yourself really, really well.
Love you, Penpa.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. Here is a 5-minute meditation where we encourage you to sit still and listen to the music and meditate.